Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Myers here with Rhys Gadbois and our friend Brian, who's going to be joining us today. And this is Of Mountains and Men. So today we're gonna have our first guest, and we're gonna talk about education, Catholic education, just kind of all the different things about that. But first, I think we'd like to introduce our guest. So Brian teaches at the same school as Rhys.
Do we want to name it?
I don't know.
I don't want to.
Yeah, I was intentionally
cool,
not
just
giving the
making
name
sure.
because I just figured if people know you guys, they'll know. But like, I don't think we need to
I'm cool with
go
that.
that specific.
Sweet.
But yeah, I think just Brian, if you want to give us a little bit of an intro of your own background, how you came into teaching, various different things, any fun facts about you that you'd like to share.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. So I grew up, went to Catholic school, lost my faith around 8th grade or so. I was sort of precocious in rejecting my faith. I didn't get confirmed. I ran around all throughout high school and acted like a jerk, whatever else. And only came around to my faith when I was in college. I only kind of reverted back to Catholicism when I was in college. And one of the, long story in terms of how I came back to the faith, I guess. But one thing that was really notable was that I kind of, for the first time in my life, read church documents and really engaged with what the church actually taught and what she actually said and how she reasoned her way through these teachings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember specifically reading Humanae Vitae, the document that reaffirmed the church's traditional teaching on birth control, and reading it as a very, very skeptical reader and going, you know what? I'm wrong about this. Like, I am wrong and the church is right. And there were a number of other times afterwards where about like all these different, and not even just like the hot topic controversial issues, but just a wide variety of things, I would look into what the church actually taught and realize, okay, I'm wrong about this. And the thing that I've always thought and assumed and just taken for granted is wrong, and the church is right. And when that happens to you just a variety of times or a number of different times on repeat, you kind of start to wonder, well, if the church is right about all these things, maybe the church is right about its biggest claim, right? About about first of all Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit, but then from there on, its own magisterial claims about keeping the teachings of Christ kind of preserved for the past 2,000 years. And so that was one of the things, a variety of things kind of led me to want to be a teacher. But that was one of the things, was that, I always kind of felt like, when I was in 8th grade or when I was, freshman or sophomore in high school, I would ask, because I was kind of I don't want to say like really brainiac-y kid, obviously, but I was sort of like a smart-ish kid. And so I'd ask these questions to my teachers like, okay, so why do we pray if God already knows everything that we think? And they would have no idea how to answer that kind of stuff. And so after a while of, refuting this really, really nice lady who, wasn't all that schooled in the teachings of the church, I kind of, as a really arrogant little 13-year-old, said, oh, you know what? I know better than all this stuff. I figured it out, right? I've broken this thing, broken the code. And
It's very Richard Dawkins of you.
Yeah. I was right there with that guy, right? And so, it kind of occurred to me, well, what? Why don't I try to go back and be the teacher that I would have needed when I was age, right? Kind of try to, for that one kid or that maybe 3 or 4 kids who have those questions and are sort of, think they know better than all this stuff, be able to really kind of explain in a forceful and obviously, kind, but sort of like, a clear way, pithy and clear way, okay, this is what the church teaches. And so that was really my big inspiration for getting into it. I've been at it for 5 years. I actually worked as a youth minister for 2 years prior to that. So it was and I've volunteered in 1.5 million different youth groups. I was actually kind of a part-time youth minister last year as well, in addition to being a teacher. So I have a lot of, I guess, experience working with kids, and specifically trying to bring them closer to Christ. So that's what brings me here.
Yeah.
Brian, where did you go to school? Where did you go to college?
I went to the University of Notre Dame.
Whoa.
Nice.
Dude, that's pretty serious. Wow.
Yeah, some people have heard of it.
Yeah, just a small school in Indiana, right?
There's a movie. It's called Rudy. You should go watch that.
That's what it's mostly known for.
It is actually a great movie.
Yeah, I haven't seen that forever. I was thinking like a month ago, I'm like, I need to watch Rudy, but I can't now. But I will eventually later. No,
And what
Brian.
did you? Oh, sorry. Go
I
ahead.
was gonna say Brian does not like to talk about the fact that he attended the University of Notre Dame.
You picked up on that, didn't
I
you? Okay,
I picked up on it. I think within the first week of knowing you.
That's
I was like, you went to Notre Dame, and you're like, Rhys, you know what? Let's just stop talking about it right now.
I mean, not to. Well, I mean, now I'm talking about it, right? But okay, I mean, because the thing is that when people hear you went there, they go, "Oh wow, isn't that so?" Like you guys just did, right? Like you faked doing, right? Like, "Oh wow, isn't that so?"
That was
impressive?
real. That was authentic.
Yeah, actually, that was
Yeah,
authentic.
right. I know it was so surprising. I'm wearing a sweatshirt that says Notre Dame on it
Yeah,
right now.
I mean, true, but
But you know, because then they start assuming, or then sometimes, I mean, I've actually had a lady say to me, "Oh, you must be really smart and really rich." I'm like, dude, I am neither one of those things. I don't know what you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
And you know, it's just easier, right? It's just kind of easier to say, "Oh yeah, I went to college out in Indiana, whatever, school."
Yeah.
Yeah.
You drive a Ford Focus too, so there's.
Yeah. Not anymore, actually. I got a Honda Accord now.
Oh, okay. That's actually pretty slick.
oh, nice.
Focus broke down.
You're set for the next 10 years of your life, I would say.
More than 10.
Hopefully.
Maybe 20. Hopefully, I mean, Hondas are long lasting.
Till I die,
cars, so-
man. Yeah, I know.
Those transmissions on the Hondas, they tell you. We act like we know what we're talking about. Okay, so
So wait, what did you study at Notre Dame? Though?
Yeah, I actually studied history, and I
Okay.
minored in theology. So,
Gotcha.
yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
Nice. What would you say the theology was like at Notre Dame?
Okay, so let's talk about this. This is good. I'm glad you bring this up because whenever they talk about Notre Dame, most people are like, "Oh, wow, that's so great," blah blah blah. And then in Catholic world, it has just like the worst reputation in the entire world, right? They're like, "Oh, you hippie, liberal, communist, whatever," right? Sure. And what are they turning into Buddhist over there? Right? Okay, sure, right, guys. You know, and you understand why it has that reputation because the university does a lot of just really high profile bad things, like let's invite Barack Obama here and give him an honorary degree and make a big fanfare about him, and let's have this.
Yeah.
They had something. It was like a drag queen festival or some kind. I didn't really follow it too closely because it just made me sort of sad. But whatever. They have like a lot of sort of like high profile and newsworthy type, just disobedient heterodox actions, I guess. But when you actually get there, it's this very interesting mix where you do have that stuff going on, right? And there are some people who walk around who espouse some, really kind of questionable things. But there's also like this subculture of people who, you have kids who are praying the rosary at 10 o'clock at night out in the snow, right? Like outside. You have, the theology department is actually really, really solid. First, it's actually the number one rated theology program in the country. So take that, Steubenville, or wherever. Yeah.
And you said that because of Rhys.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I without even intending to, right? Because I went there without being in touch with my faith at all, right? That was not my motivation for going there. And actually, there's a certain way. Not that the university should water down its Catholic identity for the sake of attracting people like me, but incidentally, it does kind of have that effect sometimes, where there are a good number of people who go there sort of just to go there, right? Because it's like, oh yeah, it's like a fancy school, right? Sure, I'm between Georgetown and Notre Dame, and okay, sure, I'm going to go to this other one, right? They have football there, whatever, right?
Right.
And sometimes those people end up getting wrapped in, and I'm proof of that, I guess. So even though its witness has been certainly inconsistent throughout its time, some of the fruit that's come out of it, I can personally vouch for sure.
Did you just drop that you were accepted at Georgetown?
No, I didn't actually.
Oh, okay.
First of all, I wasn't accepted there. I got rejected from there.
okay.
But what I was saying, yeah,
Notre Dame
right.
over
What I was saying is that basically a lot of people are sort of like, okay, sure,
No,
I have
no.
all these different types of places I can go to,
Yeah, that
right?
makes sense.
And this is a pretty estimable one. It's got these high-ranking, blah blah blah, whatever. So
Notre Dame has produced some excellent professors, like Dr. John Bergsma.
Oh, I didn't realize he
got
went
his,
to Notre Dame.
got his
That's awesome.
PhD. Dr. Brent Petrie.
They both went to Notre Dame?
I believe Dr. Brent
Oh,
Petrie
wow,
did.
okay.
Or he was working for at least a school connected to the University of Notre Dame. But also a lot of professors from the Augustine Institute, like Dr. John Seahorn, who he's not super well known, I think, but
I've heard of him. I think
he's a good man,
Yeah.
really good man.
Well, I think correct me if I'm wrong, but the perception that I've had in recent years of like Notre Dame, for example, and I think this is more common than people realize, like even Catholic U, for example, like Catholic University of America in DC, I think is similar in some ways, that like there's the public perception that happened in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, where like there were a lot of kind of wacky theological things that were happening in like the theology departments at those places. But in recent years, there's been much more of a resurgence of just solid theologians going through those places and being part of those departments. And so, like, to your point, it seems like there's more like the outward perception of like some of those like public things that a place like Notre Dame might do that make, you know, people in the Catholic world cringe a little bit, and they're kind of like, you know, why would you do this? But in the actual like depth of like the program itself, right? Like there's actually a lot of, from what I've heard at least, it seems like there's a lot of solid theologians at Notre Dame now, like teaching there.
Yeah, definitely. So in the late 90s, actually, there was kind of a intentional type of thing where the guy was promoted to the chair of the theology department, a guy named John Cavadini, who's just like a really, really kind of, you know, highly esteemed theologian. And he's very, I mean, he's Orthodox as they come, right? He's got 7 kids, whatever else. And, you know, he very intentionally said, okay, sure, I'm going to make this place, not only am I going to make this theology department better, but I'm going to make it more sound. And are there a few kind of wacky people kind of hanging around still? Sure, of course, right? You know, part of the reason why I think Notre Dame is but I mean, Peter, really quick, just to kind of wrap up your point, the day-to-day life of a student there is not defined by, oh, they invited Obama here.
Exactly.
Right? Like, I mean, like the day-to-day life of a student is and the thing that is kind of more actively forming the student is just a much more wide variety of stuff, right? Now, I mean, part of the reason why Notre Dame is sort of the forefront of a lot of these sort of quarrels about Catholic education is, I mean, first of all, because it's sort of like the most visible, probably, Catholic school, right? I mean, it's got, in addition to just like having a really good football team, it is really good academically. And so, like, it's kind of, in a certain way, I mean, they brag about being the premier Catholic university, right? People can haggle about that, whatever, but I don't know. There's something to be said for that, I guess. And then also because they were sort of, I don't know how much you guys know about this, but the Land O'Lakes Statement was this thing that came out in 1967.
Oh, yes. I just heard about this recently.
Okay, yeah, sure. I can talk about this one if you want. We can have an entire podcast about this. But so in 1967, a group of college presidents, Catholic college presidents, got together and said, we're going to declare our autonomy from the Catholic Church. Yeah.
And these were mostly, from what I heard, these were mostly priests and religious.
Oh,
like
yeah. Because
priests,
back then,
brothers, sisters. Like
back
it was
then,
mostly religious because that was who was running the Catholic
exactly
schools.
Right. Yeah, sure. Because back then, I mean, the idea of having like a lay person or like there's some college, I think it's College of the Holy Cross, or one of them up in Massachusetts has like a Jewish lady running it. It's like, okay, this is just very, very strange, right? It's just a very, very weird thing. But yeah, so all these priests who were presidents of the universities got together in Land O'Lakes, Wisconsin, which was owned by Notre Dame, and they signed this document saying that we're going to declare our autonomy from the Catholic Church. We're not going to let the church kind of hamper our ability to pursue the truth, right? Which once you kind of take that mindset that the church is a hindrance to pursuit of the truth, it's like, all right, sure, you've already assumed something that's really, really bad, right?
Yeah.
Now, when you look at the history of Catholic schools kind of in the lead up to that, there were certain times where it was like, okay, sure, I think in Catholic U they wanted to bring in this one theologian. I forget who it was. It wasn't might have been Charles Kern. It might have been Hans Kuhn. I forget who.
Okay. Oh, yeah. I think I've heard
read
about
a little
this. I think
bit
it
of
might have been Charles Kern, wasn't it?
I think. Oh, you know what it was? Actually, I take it back. It wasn't that they wanted him to go speak there. He was actually working there.
Yeah,
and
he was the one working there.
I think
Wasn't
he was
that during the
tenure.
Yeah.
And so you say, okay, well, you can look back anyway on the kind of pre-Land O'Lakes things and find different times when the bishop or the superior or whoever was a little bit just too heavy-handed in the running of the day-to-day school, or at least arguably, right? Because I mean, some of the people who weren't allowed to come speak there, some of the censures that were put on theologians or whatever, did perhaps hamper things that might have been worth kind of airing out. The problem is that they basically like perceived this small problem and went 180 degrees in the other direction and basically turned, for the most part, into just secular campuses, right? And Notre Dame and Catholic U are really the only two that are kind of self-consciously trying to walk the line in a certain way and sort of have some of the more kind of traditional college type things and also still have, a really strong Catholic identity. How successful they are, I guess, is an interesting question, debate. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've heard the thing about John Cavadini, and I think he was the dissertation director for Dr. John Seahorn as well. I did double check. Dr. Brent Petrie did get his PhD at University of Notre Dame. So there's hope, and it produced people like you, which if it weren't for that, you wouldn't be in this podcast right now.
It's me and Brent Petrie. We're right neck and neck.
Yeah, exactly.
Honestly, we were originally supposed to have him, and we told him we'd rather have Brian.
Well, and I think to the point, though, that you were just talking about, Brian, with the Land O'Lakes thing and all that, I think there is something to be said, which this might be something we'll get into in a little bit later, but just a point to draw out, I think, from that is the concept of obedience that has been so fraught for the last like 60 years, let's say, in the church. Because one of the things that kind of comes out in that whole scenario, to your point, like, yes, perhaps some of the bishops and superiors may have been a little heavy-handed per se, but at the same time, you could also point to many times in history where even more important people in the church, like the Vatican, censoring people like Padre Pio, who then but like he was obedient to that and said, I will follow the leaders of the church, even if they could be wrong. I will like do what they're saying. And in the long run ends up being vindicated for actually being obedient.
Right.
Versus this kind of modern philosophy that has like crept in a lot of like, oh, well, the leader's probably just wrong, so I should just go do my own thing. And I think you could see a little bit of that in the in the Land O'Lakes kind of concept of like, oh, well, we don't want to be under the, you know, the oppressive leadership of the bishops or of the whoever. So we're going to be our own independent Catholic schools. You know, we're still Catholic, but we're independent. But then you end up with this really touchy, tricky kind of scenario of how do you stay true to the Catholic identity if you don't really have, you know, who's guiding the ship at that point? Like, it's almost like a ship without a captain in a sense, because yes, you have the person who's in charge of the university, but then there's no oversight from the church as a whole.
Yeah, well, I will say there are these sort of safeguards, I guess, in a certain way. So one of in Notre Dame's, I don't know, in their, I don't know what it is exactly, but in some of the things that they have to kind of guide how they do things, you know, it is required that a Holy Cross priest will always be the president of the university, right? That is never allowed to change.
That's good.
There's also this, what do they call it, like the Guardian Council or something? It had some kind of interesting name of these 12 priests who, no matter what kind of happens, if they all get together, they can veto whatever the university does. So, which is an interesting thing, right? But the idea, when Father Ted Hesburgh, who was the president at the time, kind of implemented this, his idea was, okay, we're going to give sort of the university a little bit of room to run. That was kind of how he viewed it. But if there's ever anything the university is countenancing doing that would like really sink the ship or would really just kind of incorrigibly destroy the university's identity, these guys can all kind of come together and just say, you know what, we're not doing that one, which is an interesting idea. As far as I know, they've never actually acted upon that because, I mean, you know, the university's never done anything that was just like, I mean, they've done things that are like, okay, sure, high profile, bad, but never done anything that was like, whoa, like really, really bad. Like, okay, now you cannot call yourself a Catholic school anymore. It's never been that bad. And I mean, and then there's all kinds of politics about who gets chosen for that position and blah, 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 right? Real quick, we can kind of get off this topic, but one last thing, fun fact. 1960s, they were looking for a new head of the theology department. They interviewed a guy. Actually, I want you guys to take a guess. Who do you think they interviewed for this?
And what?
In the 60s, you said?
In 1960s, notable theologian they interviewed to be the new head of the theology department at Notre Dame.
Was he American?
That'd be giving it away. No.
Was it Ratzinger?
It was.
Oh
yeah.
my gosh.
Yeah, no,
no
actually,
way.
I swear to you, yeah, right, He turned it down.
Okay.
Yeah.
Strange.
Yeah, right, I know. Something more important happened with him, right?
Yeah,
but he turned it down basically, and supposedly, I mean, if the rumors are true, supposedly the reason why he turned it down was because he wasn't confident enough in his English skills to be able to teach American students.
Wow.
What's
amazing about his writing is how well it translates.
Yeah.
Like he's writing in German, and he's also writing. I'm pretty sure Ratzinger wrote everything in pencil.
I think I've heard that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he had his own style of shorthand that enabled him to be really efficient with his writing. But even though it's not the original language, when we're reading it in English, it's still so
translate
easy
really well.
and beautiful.
And kind of poetic, right?
Oh my
yeah.
gosh.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like this dusty, dry, Thomistic. I mean, honestly, especially like given the fact that he's German, you would think it'd be very like, you know, cut and dry, systematic and whatever.
Yeah.
And it's
Well, and some of his
fun.
works are very systematic, but
Yeah.
he has a lot of very poetic
Right.
writing.
Oh
yeah.
my
and
goodness.
even the systematic stuff, it's not like, you know, it's not like you're reading the Summa, right? It's not like it's just like,
Yeah.
okay, sure,
No, that's
here
true.
are the truth we're going to get, you know. He always kind of intersperses some really kind of beautiful poetic language about God and faith and all those other things.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point about the history with. Well, so wait, was there more to the Ratzinger being?
Oh, I don't know of anything else behind the story. I mean, by that point, he had obviously. I mean, now granted, it is an interesting. I've never actually thought about this before, but there is this sort of narrative about him, and who knows, right? But there's this sort of narrative about him about how previously, before Vatican II, he was sort of like a liberal type of guy, supposedly. And then once he saw sort of some of the excesses of the council, he sort of doubled back a little bit. I don't know how much that's true. I've only read stuff here and there, so I can't really make a judgment on that. I know it's disputed, whatever else. But it is kind of an interesting thing that I think about. If this was happening in late 60s or maybe early 70s, I don't know the date, like where was he at in his theological journey at that point? You know? And would it have continued the same way?
Yeah.
Interesting thoughts.
That is a really interesting point. So yeah, maybe we can come back to that a little bit, to the Land O'Lakes thing, because I do think that's relevant to Catholic education as a whole. I was actually just
100%.
having this conversation with somebody recently about how that was like the foundation for what has trickled down now into high schools and middle schools in Catholic education, that have become like drastically independent from dioceses and from any sort of like oversight. And that's, I think, a big part of where the kind of drifting away thing has happened. But maybe if we want to kind of come back a little bit now to getting to the basics of like the topic of education to start with, and then like Catholic education. So maybe Rhys, do you want to give kind of a little intro definition of what we're going to talk about with education here, and then we can kind of go from there?
Yeah, or maybe we could just discuss what we mean by education together. I mean,
Yeah.
I think of education from the Latin word educare, which means to lead forward into something.
That sounds right.
Which is consistent with Plato's allegory of the cave, because the allegory of the cave is about how bad education is and how great it can be. Because in the cave, they're all guessing at what truth is, and they have no idea. But one person escapes outside of the cave and encounters truth in its authentic self and its true sense, and then the person who goes out and encounters the truth journeys back into the cave and tries to lead people out of it.
Yeah.
And they don't want to go. They're all like cursing them out and stuff.
Oh, they don't want to. Yeah, they typically end up killing the person who wants to lead them to the truth, which is something we see reoccurring throughout all of history. We see it with Socrates. We see it with Jesus. We saw it with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose day we celebrated yesterday, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Correct.
okay,
Yeah.
all right. Sorry, we've gotten so many days off of school the past 2 weeks because of weather. I'm like, did we have a day off because of a holiday or because of weather? But yesterday was holiday, today was weather. Now, so what do we think about that definition of education, to lead someone forward and maybe to complete that into the truth?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Sounds good?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's particularly good because it gets down to some of what we'll probably talk about a little bit, though, of like what it means to educate in a sense. So I think that is a very important definition.
Here, I think, is a better question. I apologize to our listeners who are hearing the little buzzing in the background. But what do you think people today in the modern world think education is?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a certain way in which I'm not really sure that. I'm not really sure. All right, ready? So to be honest with you, I'm not really sure how many parents actually think that that is the thing that their kid is going there to do, right? I mean, like, and even sometimes, I mean, this is more apparent to me when I taught middle school, because you just dealt with parents more often, right? Like with high school kids, they pretty much are willing to sort of say, okay, sure, son, you got to go take care of that yourself, right? You talk to the teacher, you figure that out. With middle school kids, you're much more involved with the parents. And oftentimes they would kind of say things that, I mean, it wasn't maybe ever quite this flagrant, but it was sort of like, okay, sure, if the test is coming up, just drill it in your brain, and then afterwards you can just dump it out on the paper, and then afterwards just like whatever, right? Just like make sure that you get it in there for the test. And it's sort of, you kind of ask yourself, okay, what are you trying to accomplish exactly? What do you think that your kid is here to do, right? And if you ask them, they would say learn, but wait a minute, right? Like, do you actually think that, or is this just sort of like it's almost like, there's a story about when English sailors first discovered Hawaii. They met the native Maori people there, and they had all these rules, these taboo rules, right? It's where we get the English word taboo from. And, the rules didn't make any sense. And when they asked for an explanation, okay, sure, like why can't men and women eat together, and why can't some of these other things happen? They would just say it's taboo, but they couldn't actually explain it all, right? And then later, the king, I think his name was Kamehameha II or something like that, he just abolished all the rules, and nobody really cared, right? And the idea behind that, what sociologists have kind of inferred from that, is that these rules sort of at a certain point in the nation's history had made sense. There had been a context for those rules that made the whole thing kind of hang together. And that context kind of went away, and the rules just sort of endured, right? Which is why when it was kind of like abolished, nobody really cared. It was sort of like, okay, sure, whatever, right?
Yeah.
And I think a kind of a similar type of thing has happened with education, right? Where it's sort of at some point had a very, very different place in our culture. What that place is probably sort of varied throughout time, right? But now at a certain, I think it's basically, I hate to put it this way, but for a lot of people, they wouldn't be able to formulate it this way. And if they heard it, they might even object to it. But it's largely a coming of age ritual for kids, right? After you kind of go through these 13 or 16 or however many years of education, okay, then after that you can go and get a real job, you can go get married, you can go get your own house, you can go do those other things that come along with being an actual adult. What actually kind of goes on in that classroom for those 16 years is sort of irrelevant at that point, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, since I work as a teacher, I guess this has happened, but for the vast, vast, vast majority of people, once you're 5-10 years into your career, for sure, they're not going to ask you, okay, what classes did you take and what did you learn in them? They're just not going to ask that, right? They're going to look to make sure that you have the degree. They're going to look at your GPA, maybe. They're going to look to see what school it's from, whatever. But they're not going to actually ask you what the actual learning was that took place.
Absolutely.
Because really what they want to see is, okay, sure, you have completed this thing. You have done this coming of age ritual. And to a certain extent, I don't think that that's all a bad thing either, right? I mean, like, because there's a degree to which some of what we teach in school is just the ability to kind of conform to outside expectations. If somebody asks you to get this paper done by next Tuesday and you are able to do it, okay, sure, that's a valuable life skill that you're going to need when you're a parent, when you're just a office worker, whatever, right? So the ability to kind of like conform yourself to sort of annoying outside tasks, like that's a virtue, it seems to me. The problem is that it's become sort of solely that, like that's the real thing. And it's really kind of a curious thing in a certain way that, here's the way I put it. So all throughout middle school, the reason, what they kind of tell you, your motivation is, okay, sure, guys, it's really important for you to work hard. It's important for you to get grades because you're going to need that to get into high school. Okay. And in high school, what they're telling you the whole time, or a lot of people are telling you the whole time, at least what I was told the whole time, is it's important to work hard because that's how you get into college.
Yep.
And in college, hey, man, you got to work hard. You got to get a GPA. You got to study this thing, whatever, so that way you can get your first job. Okay? And they're going to hire you if you have a 2.0. Sure.
Yep.
Then you get your first job, and then it no longer matters.
Yep.
And it just seems to me that, these really, really formative years between the ages of 5 and 21, or maybe people who go on to advanced degrees, 24 or whatever, if all of that stuff is just a prelude to get your foot in the door for your first job, I don't know, man. Like, there's got to be something more productive and more fruitful we can do with that 15,
Correct.
20 years of life, So
Well, and yeah, exactly. I mean, I agree. And I think that's why, like, to the question that you asked, Rhys, like, I think I would say that people today would generally say, like kind of like what you said, Brian. I think one of the other answers that I've heard, I think, would be that education is about simply imparting knowledge in a very basic sense of, like, you just need to, like, learn the things so that you can, to the point you just made, Brian, pass the tests and get to the next thing.
Yeah.
And, like, really, in a real sense, that's not, to your point, Rhys, about education being to lead someone. I think one of the most fundamental things that we can get into more, but is the ability to think. That, like, a big part of education should be teaching people how to think properly, because there's a lot of like even complicated things that you can understand and learn on your own without them being taught to you if you know how to think, just using logic and reason and our perception, because we are beings that use senses to perceive things. And as we perceive things, if we know how to think about things and how to reason things, you can make a lot of logical conclusions, a lot of logical, like, oh, this is what this, and you can learn things on your own. So, like, and I think a great point about that too is that a lot of the things that people learn in school nowadays, they could learn from reading a book. Like,
yeah.
And so, like, at that point, what is the point of the teacher? Well, what the point of the teacher should be, really, I would say, is to, not to jump too far ahead, but I would argue that part of the point of the teacher should be to help the students understand how to think and how to read things critically and how to understand things critically, rather than simply how to just regurgitate something back that they already heard or read.
I think we should now, instead of asking what is education, what do we think it is, what does the world think it is, I think we should also ask the question, why does education exist? I mean, kind of going back to the Hawaiian analogy or like comparison of just like these things exist within a specific context, and within that context they have a unique purpose. So obviously education 1,000 years ago served arguably maybe a different purpose, but nowadays, the time we find ourselves in, education, I think if we ask ourselves what purpose does it serve, and I think you've probably already answered that, right? It's to get your foot into the door, to get that high school diploma, then to go on to college or go to trade school or whatever, and then eventually get your first job. Do you guys think that that was what the founding educators had in mind when they implemented the system into the United States?
So my understanding of this, and I mean, the history is not something I'm totally well versed on, but I mean, my understanding is that we incorporated basically the Prussian education model. That's why we call things like kindergarten, right? That's a German word.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
yep.
It is, yeah.
And
I was like, where are the gardens? When I was a
Yeah,
kid.
no. When I was a kid,
No,
I was so
yeah.
confused by that. And why do they spell garden differently? Whatever, right? But you know, the understanding, as I've, or at least as has been told to me, is that the kind of initial idea, at least in Germany and in Prussia, was to sort of get people who were sort of just going to be productive members of the state, who would say yes sir, no sir, whatever, because that's a lot of what is instilled in you in school, right? I mean, certainly in the early stages, it's kind of like a socialization and a sort of willingness to take outside direction, right? And you know, me and Rhys and I teach at a school that, yeah, I'm sure not too many listeners are gonna be really fussy about the grammar, but I am. I don't know.
I don't
Call
blame
himself a teacher? Like,
Yeah,
my goodness.
what a loser. Yeah, right. But Rhys and I teach at a school where the kids are really, I mean, remarkably well behaved. It seems to me. I mean, like, but
Relatively, yeah.
I think so. I don't know. I mean, granted, I've taught at schools where most of the kids
You've also
are
taught
little-
at middle schools.
Yeah, it's true, right? But I mean, I don't know. It seems to me like, you know, if a kid is acting up in some way, all I have to do is kind of look at them, and all of a sudden it calms down, right?
Yeah, fights do not happen at our
Fights
school.
do not
That's
happen. I guess I had one kid yell at me one time, but whatever. I mean, it didn't go that far, right? You know, I've never really. I've only dealt with like 2 or 3 discipline issues, and they're all pretty easy to handle, right? Whereas, you know, granted, I taught middle school is fine, but in the high school that I went to, there were like actual discipline problems, right? And I went to a Catholic school, I went to a private school, I went to kind of like a sort of a, I don't know what you call it, but sort of like a more uptight private school than a lot of other places were. And still there were like substantial discipline problems as opposed to the pretty much wimpy stuff that, you know, you and I may sometimes have to deal with.
Sure. What are we talking about?
Yeah, dude, I lost my train of
Sorry,
thought,
kindergarten.
Oh yeah,
Prussia.
right, Prussia, right. But you know, so it seemed to me anyway. Sorry, that was all a big long tangent.
That was my fault entirely.
Entirely your fault. You're right. Yeah. But I mean, the initial purpose of it in Prussia was to kind of get people who would just be good servants of the state, right? I mean, like at that point, I mean, Germany was sort of a weird hodgepodge. Germany only became a thing in 1871, right? And so there were a lot of different German tribes and nations and things like that, and people had all these local sort of affiliations and loyalties and things like that, as they wanted to get people to actually be loyal to the state qua state, right? And so they crafted this system that was very much like a yes sir, no sir type of system, and we kind of brought that over here. How it got over here is a little bit mysterious to me. I'm not really sure why people said, okay, yeah, sure, this right here should be our model. I mean, Horace Mann was sort of the father of education, and that sounds like a German name to me, so maybe that's just what he knew. And he was an influential guy. I don't know if there's broader reasons for it. I really don't know. But that's kind of why it was established in the form that it initially took. And, you know, I think it sort of worked better. I mean, because honestly, whatever, if you talk to your parents and ask how much they learned in high school, it's going to be pretty low number of things, right? It seems to me, and that's the way for most people. Because I mean, honestly, I'm branching off now, right? But like, whenever you kind of like force a kid to, or force anyone to like learn a thing, it's just not going to work very well unless they have some kind of outside motivation. If it's just, hey, you listen to this thing, I don't care if you care about it or not. I'm not sometimes even going to try to present it in a particularly interesting or thought-provoking way. And if you don't do that thing, or at least convince me that you've done that thing, I'm going to punish you. I mean, give me a break. Like you're not going to learn that way, right?
Mhm.
And especially, I mean, I was saying to someone the other day who was one of my coworkers was sort of just sort of bothered by student apathy and whatnot. And I said to her, look, if you were forced to do any single thing for 13 years straight and you didn't get paid for it, you didn't really get rewarded for it in a particular way, the purpose of it was not particularly clear to you, and if you did a bad job of it, you'd be punished. You know, you'd hate it by the end. You'd be really, really resentful of it, and you'd kind of just game the system insofar as you could, right? Just do the minimum that you can in order to sort of pass the test and not get punished and get the sort of small little rewards that they get, and get out of there, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's sort of a weird thing that a lot of teachers sort of don't see it that way and maybe don't have that much sympathy with their students. Because when you really think, because that's what we tell kids, right? From age 5 to the age of 18 and maybe longer than that, you're forced to do this stuff. You're forced to listen to these people about these subjects that you may or may not have any interest or care for. And whatever, if you do a bad job at all that stuff we're telling you to do, these sort of, and a lot of it also like busy work and a lot of sort of arbitrary type tasks. And if you don't do a good job at it, like, okay, you're going to get punished. You're going to get yelled at. You're going to get grounded. You're going to get this bad grade. You might have to talk to the principal or whatever. Right. I mean, it's really, I think that adults and teachers and people who work in schools more broadly need to kind of try to imagine themselves into the situation that we are creating for these kids. Right. And I mean, and one of the things that sort of, what's the word, sort of aggravates the problem, I guess, is the fact that most teachers were themselves really good students. I myself was sort of an exception to that. I was a little hellraiser growing up, fine. But okay, sure. I mean, like most teachers were sort of like, you know, these sort of bookish, well-organized type kids who, you know, like getting the good grades and kind of liked being in school and whatnot. And so they went back to school. And so for a lot of them, it's sort of like, wait a minute, these kids don't want to learn this stuff that I think is so cool. What's wrong with you kids, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's just not really a fair way to look at it.
The reason I asked the question, why education, at least in our certain context, and it's interesting you brought up, we've copied the Prussian model. Yeah, I don't know exactly why we adopted that model, but I can see why we found it useful. I'm not an anti-capitalist. I want to be abundantly clear, but I'm also a realist when I see that capitalism has a very ugly underbelly, especially when you apply human greed to the scenario. And I could see that someone who thinks like a diehard capitalist, and then they look at, okay, how do I produce the greatest workers? They're not necessarily going to care about how well educated these workers are. I need these workers to do one job over and over again for the rest of their life. And sure, we can have people, we need a few educated people to do the complicated jobs, like Peter over here to be an accountant, right? But not everybody has to do that, right? So we have this system. What do we need? What is the bare minimum we need for it to work? I think you could make an argument that because of the capitalist mindset, and like I said, I'm not. I can't think of anything better than capitalism. I'm not, to be quite frank with you. But when you have this approach to the world in which, oh, it's money, and how much money can I make doing the simplest thing? Once you look at education within that context, I don't think we should be very surprised as to why our education system is the way it is. Because like you said, our parents can't tell us what they learned. I can't exactly tell you what I learned when I was in middle school and high school.
Yeah, I remember a handful of lessons, a handful of things. I mean, some of the skills I picked up, sure. But like, I mean, when you think about whatever, right? Like when you think about the fact that somebody was paid thousands of dollars and thousands of dollars were spent on me learning chemistry, and I could not tell you more than like a very, very handful of things. Like I could probably find hydrogen on the periodic table, and that's about it, right? So when you think about the fact that like we have spent all this kind of money and, you know, all these different resources and time, energy, whatever else, trying to get me at a certain point to learn chemistry, and it just totally flopped. I don't
think
know.
it's because we really don't care.
Yeah, no,
I think deep
agree.
down inside, we really don't care if the average American memorizes the periodic table.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course.
And this kind of goes back to your point where what they really care about is that piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of that phrase, it's just a piece of paper, is something that is being applied to a lot of things nowadays, like marriage. It is just a piece of paper. Education.
The other day.
Yeah, it is just a piece of paper. And you know what? The way the world is acting, they're not necessarily wrong. And I think you would agree. We see it as a problem. We know why we're there. And so I think one of the reasons education is struggling so much is because of our why for it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. One more thing, because you were talking about how part of the reason for adopting the system was probably to sort of support the capitalist model. Part of it may also have been the fact that when you look at like America, the fact that this country hangs together is kind of a wild. I mean, when you think about the fact that
It is a miracle.
it's a miracle.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's for sure.
you have no connection over religion, no connection over ethnicity. A lot of these people, were very kind of segregating for a long time. Like, I mean, in addition to sort of whatever, like de jure segregation of black people and white people and whatever else. I mean, like people very much self-segregated, right? Where there's
Yeah,
a Polish
all the
neighborhood and an
cultures,
Irish
yep.
neighborhood and an Italian neighborhood and whatever
We were
else.
talking about that in our community
Oh,
episode.
were you really?
Like people say America is a melting pot, but I heard a comedian make an argument that no, it's just a bunch of melting pots. All the Italians live together, all the Irish
Yeah.
live together. No, yeah.
Mhm.
Right. And then also, I mean, like, when you think about who was actually coming over and settling, and this is part of the reason why we probably have a very individualistic culture in this country. People who were coming over here and settling were people who had just like the wherewithal and the willingness to go and get on a ship, go across the ocean, and go to some place that you've never seen before. I don't know, man. Like in the 1600s, and you might die of scurvy. I don't know, right?
Never
like
gonna see your family again.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. That takes some real cojones. And so you have all these sort of ingredients into this country that's a tough thing to hang together, right?
Yeah.
And that's and so that's why we created the flag and the Pledge of Allegiance and all these different things to kind of imbue loyalty to a state that otherwise would not, right? I mean, because whatever, like in France, when the vast majority of people are ethnically French, okay, sure, it kind of makes sense if you're really, really concerned about your allegiance to your fellow Frenchmen. It makes sense to sort of like have allegiance to the king or the at a certain given point, like the prime minister, the premier, or whatever, right? Here, it's just not as obvious, right? Like, I mean, what? Okay, sure, right? I mean, you're from Seattle, I'm from New Jersey. What exactly would have, or already, like, let's say that there was like in Seattle, some guy who is, I don't know, an Asian gay Rastafarian. Okay, now what do I have in common with that guy that makes us both Americans? Pretty much nothing, right? I mean,
Other
like
than
Just the fact that you
geography.
both live in the same
Yeah,
country. That's
right,
it.
but
I
but,
mean,
but what does the country mean, right? I mean, like if
No,
you were to
that's what I'm
take
saying.
an Irish Catholic priest who lives in Canada, he and I would have much more in common than this guy out in Seattle, including geographical proximity. And so part of the reason why I think also we adopted the education system that we did was because, okay, sure, in this country that we have here, it's sort of a rickety thing, and we're not really sure that people are going to actually have allegiance to the state, and so we need to sort of imbue that in people, and that would be my guess anyway.
Interesting. Cephas, what you thinking about?
I mean, I think it's just all. It all makes sense to me what you guys are saying, and I think I think of like the underlying reasons of like I think some of that comes out of the Industrial Revolution too, which I know was primarily in Europe, but when you think about it, that same philosophy to your point of like the capitalism thing, again, not to say that I'm not being anti-capitalist, but just that like that can lead to this mindset of producing kind of like clone workers almost, like basically people who are, and when you think about the education system that we have, for a long time in the US at least, it has been this system of everyone has to know all the same general things for those 15 years, kind of like you were talking about, where like you don't even really specialize until college. And even then, like you still have those, everyone pretty much has those 2 years of like gen eds and all that stuff, like there's like very much this like concept of everyone should know all the same things. But when you think about it, nobody becomes a specialist at that point because everybody just knows this really. When you're trying to like know all these things, you don't have the time or the energy or the wherewithal to become a specialist. And when you think about it, though, that actually perpetuates the ability to keep people in lower positions, to keep them in, basic jobs in a sense, because if all you're able to gain from those 15 years or, at least the main, 13 years or whatever it is through high school is this very general knowledge of a bunch of things, then how would you ever be able to break out of just being stuck in like a very, particular spot? And then those who are able to go to, nice schools or good places or whatever, and, they happen to get this degree in, finance or whatever the thing is that they end up being able to, or a doctor or whatever, a lawyer, they're able to make these big, specialty things. But I guess it's just, I don't know. I'm not sure where I'm going with that precisely, but it's just an interesting reflection on, I think, on where that comes from in some sense, that it almost intentionally perpetuates this basic knowledge rather than people actually specializing.
Well, what I think is also just as concerning, or maybe more concerning, is we kind of agreed on the education definition of leading someone forward into the truth. But the current model of education does not seem to be concerned with that whatsoever.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily
Exactly.
concerned about leading someone into what is right. We're concerned about leading someone into a path that will lead them to material success, or at least lead the nation to material success. And that fits with what Brian was saying, that we care about keeping this country together, which isn't ignoble. Like, that's a good thing. But that's like, if that's the end all be all, a lot of people are, first of all, going to end up maybe a little disappointed and be like, wait, that's it? Like, there's nothing greater than that.
Yeah.
And then those who do buy into it, they're just fighting for something that really is just insufficient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're pursuing an insufficient goal, you're going to use insufficient means to obtain that goal.
Sure.
I would think.
Yep.
And I mean, I don't know anyone who's looking around being like, yeah, the current education system, excellent, like perfect. You know what I mean? We just need to work out a few kinks, but other than that, real solid.
Yeah. Actually, one time I heard a professor say something that I thought was kind of funny about with the public school system in particular, but really it applies more broadly than that, I think. When you look at it, he was sort of a character in certain ways, because Karl Marx would have a field day with this thing, okay? Because everyone benefits from this except for the kids, the thing that like is actually supposed to be benefiting them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, parents get to just like not have their kids for 8 hours a day so they can go to work, right?
Yep.
Teachers get jobs, bureaucrats get jobs, politicians get to, constantly talk about how we're going to save our schools. I mean, every time I pull up YouTube, I get this advertisement for what's this goofy guy or senator?
I've been getting the exact same ads.
Yeah, right. It
Trone, David Trone.
Yeah,
I don't even want to say his name.
Yeah, right.
But yeah.
Vote for not him, please. Yeah, right. I'm going to abuse my bully pulpit right now.
Do it.
But whatchamacallit? Yeah, I mean, whereas, like, really, when you look at all these different people who benefit from this system, like, the kids are kind of last place, right? You can say, okay, sure, they have these benefits for whatever, right? But, like, honestly, compared to what the parents get of just, like, having 8 hours to go do what they need to do or whatever, it seems like, actually, like, they get a better deal out of this than the kids do, And same thing with teachers, same thing with politicians, same thing with anyone else who's kind of involved with it.
Well, and I think that's a great point, and that's one of the things that I think bothers me most profoundly about the current education system in the U.S., and I think in some ways a lot of education systems around the world do this, and we've talked about it, I know I've talked about it with different people about Catholic education, but I also would argue it's just true about education, period. That, and if you think about the definition that we proposed of education, of leading someone, that the first and foremost educators of children should be their parents.
100%.
And I feel like that, to the point that you were just making, that's something that I've heard from so many parents, even like good people. Like, I'm not trying to be mean to anyone, but I've heard so many parents who are just like so enthusiastic about the fact that they get to just like pass off their kids to someone else and they don't have to deal with it. And it's like, that's like fundamentally like one of the most important, I would argue, at least I know I'm not a parent yet, but I would argue that's fundamentally one of the most important parts of parenthood is educating your children. And that doesn't necessarily mean you sit down in a, classroom and tell them all the things they need to learn, but to the point of that definition, it means that you lead them in the right path and you teach them how to think, and you demonstrate to them how to think, and you teach them what it means to the difference between right and wrong. And even like one thing that was striking to me, Brian, about something you were saying earlier about learning to, like how education can kind of on a basic level help you learn how to meet deadlines and stuff like that. Well, I would argue that even that you should learn first and foremost in your family, in the sense that, like, obviously, I'm not saying parents should be, holding their kids to the same exact like things that happen in school, but at the same time, like, even having basic like chores growing up that are expected of you in not a mean way, but in the proper sense of like, did you do this thing today? Then you are able to do this other thing. Did you take out the trash or whatever your chore happens to be? Can be a way to learn that like exterior, even if it is your parents, I understand it's your parents, but it's still an exterior person saying, holding you accountable to something else.
Yeah. Now, I think there might also be some good in being held to a different person's account than your parents, right? Just insofar as, I mean, first of all, because sometimes, I mean, it depends on each individual parent, right? Like my mom is a stickler for stuff, and some people's are not so much, right? But I think that a lot of parents, just have sort of like widely varying ideas about like, okay, sure, this is how many chores you should be expected to do, right? Like Rhys, I don't know what your philosophy is when your kids are going to get older, but I don't know, right? I mean, like yours and mine might be very, very different. And there might be something we said for being held to a standard that is, not only yours, but is kind of foreign to you, right? And might be something where it's like, well, mom has never expected anything like this of me before, right? This is way more particular and annoying and whatever else than what I'm expected to, and yet I'm going to kind of rise up and meet it anyway. But no, Peter, I do agree with you though that part of it should also start at home, no doubt.
Yeah, I remember my first year of teaching, just talking to a bunch of friends who are more experienced teachers than I, and I'm not sure if you picked up on this, Brian. When teachers get together, we kind of like to brag about success stories.
100%.
And the more and
I'm
more,
guilty of that.
Yeah. But let me know if I'm kind of overstepping or I'm over exaggerating. I don't think there are. I think there's a lot less success. There are far less success stories than teachers like to give off. Because let's be honest, if a kid is great in my classroom, it doesn't have a whole lot to do with me. It has a lot to do, most cases, with how they were raised.
Right.
So, for example, there's a student who's been coming to talk to Brian. I'm not going to name he or she.
You can call her a she.
Him or her.
That only
Okay, all right.
that narrows it down to about
50, okay,
4 billion people.
Yeah, there's a student who has been asking Mr. Stahl over here plenty of questions, and Brian's been doing an excellent job at answering them. Now, is that an example of a teacher leaving a serious impact on a student? I agree. Yes, definitely. 100%. Brian is doing a phenomenal job there. But the student is curious. The student is open. The student is respectful of authority because of the way she was probably raised. So I think what makes education actually work is when parents do their job and are the primary educators. Yeah. And sure, maybe they don't have to have the exact same rules as the teachers do. But nonetheless, I'm thinking back to when I was a kid. My parents taught me to just respect older people. There's something I have a problem with on the East Coast. And this probably isn't the whole East Coast. But out in Maryland, where we are, calling people Mr. last name and Mrs. last name is not a thing. It's Mr. first name and Mrs. first name.
I could not agree more
I think that's
with what you're talking about.
I think that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
I remember being like, Mr. this, Mr. that. And sure, maybe it worked for a few other families.
So I grew up in New Jersey, and that was not a thing. It's a South thing, man.
I'm from the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, it is a Southern thing.
I'm as
Although
far
it's
from the South
parts
as it
of the
gets.
South, because I grew up in Kentucky, and we still went by last names mostly. But
Kentucky's not the South, though, man. I used to live in Kentucky. It's not the South. You guys are mountain people, man. Yeah,
my
sorry.
gosh. I mean, I grew up in a very Midwestern part of Kentucky too. So
The point I'm
But
just trying
anyway,
to make is maybe it doesn't have to be that.
But your point is the
exactly.
casualty versus the formality, right? That like the casualness of saying Mr. or Mrs. first name versus the formality of saying Mr. or Mrs. last name.
The point I'm just trying to make is that my parents raised me to just respect people, especially those who are older than me. And honestly, if parents just do a good job at doing that, then half of our job as teachers is taken care of.
Yeah.
And that is just not done most of the time, unfortunately. And I think I blame Disney for that, because every Disney movie is about a kid being more right than the parents. That's how every movie begins. It's like the parents they oppress the child.
Yeah.
The kid knows better than the person who's lived for 40, 30 more years than they have. And the kid ends up being right. And the kids nowadays are like, well, if the kid is right in the movie. Like, I had a kid tell me one time, like, Mr. Gadbois, do animals go to heaven? I'm like, probably not, but I don't know for certain. Okay. And they're like, but what about All Dogs Go to Heaven? What about that movie? I'm like, you mean the animated flick from the 90s? Like, how does that strengthen your argument? The kids are and not just kids, us, we're just so influenced by like what we observe in entertainment. And, but I think, parents are the primary educators. If they do their job well enough, it makes our jobs 10 times easier. And also, it begins to make a little bit more sense. We don't have to do other things that we really shouldn't be expected to do. Like, it should not be my job to teach your kid how to necessarily be I think it's important to teach on virtue and how to teach people to be good people in society, but they should not be hearing it from me first.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Definitely not
Yeah.
first.
And they should come into school for the most part having a good understanding of what it means to be a good person.
Yeah. Now, I will say though that I think that part of our job as teachers, and maybe sort of an underrated part of our job, is just to kind of witness to just good character, right? Because
yes.
100%. I mean, like I one of the things that when I first got interested in doing this, a friend of mine had told me was, "Look, man, honest truth, they're not going to remember a single thing you tell them in class. What they are going to remember is how you treat them, right? And so if you treat them with, like, if you hold them to a high standard, but treat them with respect, treat them with love, whatever, they're going to remember that. They're not going to remember what you put on the blackboard." And honestly, that really is true, I think. I mean, like, and granted, I've talked to a handful of students here and there who, remember like one or two things I teach them, but by and large, when they come up and say, "Hey, Mr. Stahl, blah, 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 what's going on?" They're not thinking about, "Oh, that great paper you assigned," right? No, they're thinking about how you sort of treated them, right? And so insofar as you can sort of demonstrate virtue and demonstrate good character and whatnot, I think that's much more impactful in a certain way, much more lasting, definitely. And also, I mean, it's like anything else, right? I mean, like, whatever, like, you're a very virtuous guy, your kids are going to see you as the example, whatever, right? But I'm sure, I don't really know any specifics, but I'm sure there are kind of virtues that you lack or virtues that you could become stronger in. And if they see a teacher who has that thing and it's admirable in a certain way, then, like, all right, great, that's awesome, right? That should be something that they look to emulate.
Do you think that's a good thing, though, that students are not going to remember what we taught them, but they're going to remember how they felt in our room?
Is it a good thing?
Is it a good thing that we tell ourselves, "Hey, guess what?" Because I've heard that exact same speech before. "Hey, Rhys, no one's going to remember what you taught them. They're going to remember how you treated them." Is that a good thing?
No, I mean, well, it's a suboptimal thing. Now, I will say that for a teacher's perspective, I think it helps to keep you sane a little bit because, there are certain times where I talk to a kid about something we had learned like 2 weeks ago and we had tested on and whatever else, and it's just like he just stares at me totally blankly, and it's like, okay, sure. Like, if you have the mindset in it that, what I'm here to do is just like instill information and whatnot, like, you're gonna, I think as a teacher, you're gonna burn out kind of quickly, right? The system is just not set up for that to work. Is it a good thing? No, right? And there should be more things that try to, because really, I mean, I don't know. It seems to me, now you're really getting me on my high horse, but it seems to me that the role of a teacher really is to provoke curiosity more than anything else.
Yeah,
I think that's sort of like really like, if we, whatever, like, we can say all this stuff about what education is, whatever, but like, if we are kind of looking at a more concrete, like, okay, what am I going to try to do today? If you can provoke a kid to be curious about a thing or about a wide topic of things, ideally, but even just one or two things, like, then that's going to go much further. Because, hey, look, I mean, if they, go home then and look into this thing, or ask the parents, ask the priest, ask whoever, or ask you later on, or ask another teacher, whatever, well, then they have an honest chance of remembering that thing in the long term, or using their productive leisure time in the future to read up on that thing, or to watch YouTube videos on that thing, or whatever the case may be. Whereas if what you're trying to do is, the thing that is coming out of my mouth, I want you to just like keep that thing up there for forever, I think that's basically an impossible mission. You know?
No, I agree. Do you think I like that definition of a teacher where it's our duty to provoke curiosity in the student. But do you think it's a lot more difficult to do that nowadays given the apathy? And that's a leading question because, of course, it's a lot more difficult to provoke curiosity when the student is apathetic.
Well, yeah, I'm not entirely convinced that the apathy is that much higher than it has ever been. Like, I'm not really sure. I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical when you hear, I mean, how about this, ready? Like, when you read old, like, Mark Twain novels, right? It's not like Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer were, like, these studious young kids, right? No, right? I mean, like, I'm kind of a little bit skeptical. I think that probably there was more emphasis of it at home. I think there was probably more curiosity because there was just fewer distractions, right? You didn't have TikTok, you didn't have YouTube and Netflix and all this other crap. But I am a little bit skeptical that, there was a time when, like, kids came in and were not, how about this? I'm skeptical that there was ever a time when the majority of the population in high school or grade school was not largely apathetic to what's going on up at the blackboard.
I'd have to think about that because Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer were both orphans, right? Were they in foster homes?
Honestly,
I've read their stories. Yeah. It's been a long time.
Huck had a family, but I don't think he had parents living, I think. So, yeah.
I think he had, like, an aunt. And
Yeah,
that sounds about
I think
right.
is,
Yeah,
like,
and
something
Sally.
like
Yeah,
that, but,
yeah.
Good
And,
make
I
that.
don't remember the thing, but the reason I'm just curious is because Mark Twain makes like I just feel like there's a lot more Huck Finns out there, a lot more Tom Sawyers.
Well,
nowadays.
I think
Tom Sawyer could at least convince people to do things too. He was
a smart little kid.
Tom,
yeah, right.
Tom was smart. Yeah.
Could have been a student.
I guess the two things I would say like about that point that you just made, like I think maybe there's not more apathy, maybe there is, but I think there's definitely more distractions nowadays than there were.
Yeah.
And so I think that one way or the other that causes more difficulty in kids being able to pay attention in a class, for example,
Yeah.
than it used to be. Because to your point, there are so many more, like we live in a culture, people talk about it all the time. We live in a culture where people's attention spans are like so pathetic nowadays. And I don't say that to be mean to anyone, but the
Reese
reality
is
is
checking
that,
his phone right
that-
now.
Well, let's probably check on the time, I hope, although
No,
I don't know.
I'm editing the questions actually.
But you know, you think about nowadays, like people's attention spans are these like 10-second, 15-second videos and stuff, and people are growing up. And this is one of the things Reese and I have talked about too, is like how dangerous it is for young kids and teenagers and stuff to have access to things like TikTok and stuff like that so early because they're growing up with that and it's training them that way. So I think that's probably part of the issue there. But I would also I would suggest as someone who I granted I am not a teacher right now, although I may be one in the future. We'll see. It's something that I've thought about a lot, and since I have a master's in theology, but one thing that I would argue from my own experiences with like seminary, for example, and other things, and granted, yes, everyone in seminary is there for an intentional purpose. I will give you that. But at the same time, even though you are, I've seen a ton of different teaching styles through that because there's some very different teaching styles that I think aren't used very often today in like the average classroom. And what I found to be, well, I guess let me suggest it this way, that like to your point about that phrase of like they won't remember really, you know, most of or anything about what you teach them, but they'll remember how you treated them. Well, I would argue that like what matters about that more is to that phrase of, I think it's Pope Paul VI once said it, I think, of like the world remembers, what is it? It's like the world is more ready to listen to people who, you know, show the example than teachers. But if you do teach, like lead a good example first. I'm getting that phrase really wrong.
They
There's, like,
they
a
listen to
better quote, but
witnesses.
Witnesses, there it is, yes.
Yeah.
But my point, I think, would be that along those lines, that they will remember more of what you teach them if you witness it the right way.
Oh, it's 100%
And if
true.
you like
Kids love
teach them the
stories.
right way too.
Yeah.
Like if you do, you know, not at all to say, I'm not at all trying to hold up Reese as like some, you know, profound example of a great teacher.
I am,
but
yes.
but I'm just saying that
I'm
like Reese and I think have similar opinions about this, of like engaging people in a more conversational setting in one sense, of like trying to get their interest more and showing them that like you are trying to like engage them in that way too, because I know from my own experience and from a lot of people I've talked to that like the teachers in most people's experience that they remember the least from are the ones who just get up and lecture.
Yeah.
And like don't show any interest in the people, don't show any, you know, dialogue, don't show any concept of. Now, granted, some teachers I remember distinctly who had good dialogue, but they were kind of rude people. But I remember some of what they taught us because they had dialogue, but they weren't very kind. But like you still remember it because of the dialogue, even in that case. Now, I'm not suggesting that's a good idea, and I don't think that's a good idea at all.
I think it's a great idea.
But-
that's what I do every day.
You do what?
I'm rude to kids every day.
Well, actually, Reese posted about being rude, quote unquote, to kids.
I mean,
in the
sometimes
last
you gotta
podcast
do
we
it.
had
Well,
in the
you
right
can-
way.
you can
Like
poke
if you
fun
do
at
it the
them.
right way,
Yeah.
exactly. But
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
if you do it the right way, it can be engaging. And that was part of this one professor that I'm thinking of from seminary would kind of tease us a lot. But I actually found it kind of endearing, even though some guys didn't. But I think he did it the right way in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So maybe to take this conversation and focus on a different topic, I think one of my first interactions with you, Brian, was about this topic.
Oh, jeez.
And I remember I made a comment about it. And I think that was a moment where you and I knew we were going to get along really well. So
I did realize that very early on. I'm like, yeah, philosophically, this guy and I we're on the same.
yeah,
page on
we're
this
gonna
one.
be set. Brian and I share an office, and if we ever have an off mod together, we rarely get anything done during that off mod.
It's a disaster.
And we're
It
just
really is.
talking the whole time, which is a blast for me, but I have a lot of work
For
to do.
those who are not
So
teachers, what is an off mod?
off period. It's where we're
Oh,
not
okay.
teaching.
Yeah.
We're given time to work. And by work, we mean walk around the hallway, get coffee, check our mailbox, and then talk to other teachers. So,
Yeah.
Ryan, do you think people have a right to education? And by education, I mean, should it be provided for them by the government?
Wow. So I mean, yeah, I do. I think that people do have a right to education. I don't think it needs to be kind of a government mandated or government watched over thing per se, right? Like I think that, I have a friend of mine who deschools his kids.
Yeah, I've heard that's kind of a thing.
It's a thing,
Yeah.
yeah. And it basically just means, and granted, is partially this works because his friend of mine is like a super genius, right? He's got just like incredible amounts of knowledge about all kinds of different things. But basically, his kids just kind of walk around and ask questions. And every once in a while, he'll be like, hey, let me show you this cool thing, whatever. It's an algebra problem. And, let's practice thing together, whatever, right? And it's a very kind of informal type of thing. And the idea basically is that for a lot of kids, by the time you're finished with school, learning is now a sort of a noxious thing. It's like a thing you don't want to do again because it's this thing that you associate with just sort of like the grind and just pain and being forced to do things and coercion and whatever else, right? Especially for kids who are maybe less gifted, right? I mean, like if you're not only being forced to do this thing, but it's a thing that it's hard for you and everyone else is better than you at it, well then like forget it, right? Like by the time you're done, like you're out. And the idea behind deschooling is to just not make learning an onerous thing anymore, not make it like a painful, unpleasant thing. Allow kids to kind of, take their curiosity where it leads them and whatnot. And I don't know. I'm a tentative believer in it. I mean, I don't really know that much, and I'm not really. I mean, this friend of mine lives kind of far away, so I don't really see how he does that much. But I mean, like, it makes sense to me, at least in theory. So I mean, do people have a right to education? Yes, I think so. Right? I mean, like, and government certainly has. So government should set up public schools and things like that. But I don't think it should be mandated or dictated in the same way that that it currently is in a lot of places.
Yeah, people definitely have a right to education in a very broad sense.
Yeah.
If people want to learn, they should be given that opportunity to learn.
Right.
Well, and would you agree as far as like, I think you could have a right to education, but at the same time, I guess, the question of, to the point of like mandating too, like just because the government provides schools, doesn't mean anyone should be obligated to go to those schools, but also like, does it arguably mean that anyone should be obligated to go to school, period? Like, do you know what I'm getting at? Kind of in the sense of like the government overseeing private schools or home schools or things like that, where it's like nowadays there's all these standards that everyone has to meet. And I think that can get a little tricky from my perspective, but I'm curious what you're...
It does get tricky in the whole thing, because the problem is, like, at least in theory, when you ask that, should the government kind of, like, watch over these Catholic schools? In theory, the answer is absolutely not, right? Like, I mean, it's not their business, really. It's not their terrain. It's not their prerogative. It gets tricky because the whole thing is wrapped up in these other kind of like I said, coming of age ritual type things, right? Where like, okay, sure, this kid graduates from this school and college is going to look at his grades and determine it. Well, we want to make sure the school is actually teaching them something, right? And that's and given the fact that it all kind of nestles into this system that sort of is that sort of ripples out throughout the rest of the country, then when you look at it that way, it does kind of make sense. So if you were to kind of undo the sort of government oversight of schooling and whatnot, you need to sort of undo a lot of the background, stuff that's wrapped up with it, I guess.
The reason I ask, do you think people have a right to education, is because I remember there was a story my mom told me when I was younger, and I think this is a reoccurring theme for people in history who have typically been at below or just above the poverty line, who are forced to work, but they tend to cherish knowledge much more than those who just have it handed to them.
Yeah. Or force-fed to them.
Or force-fed
exactly,
to
your
them.
point.
Yeah, and so sure, people do have a right to knowledge and education. But it seems to be the case that when you give away something for free, it loses its obvious value. I'm not necessarily sure how to remedy that. But I think when you tack on all these other issues that are going on with education, and you also throw on even when we charge kids for education, like we're doing at our school because it's a private school, the stigma that education doesn't really have a whole lot of value still permeates those atmospheres.
Education is the only thing people are willing to pay for and not receive.
Yeah.
Cool quote.
Wow.
Yeah. I didn't make that up.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah, which if I could just note real quick about the deschooling you called it, right?
I think it's called unschooling, actually.
I think those are actually different. I mean, unschooling is a thing too. I don't really know the distinction though.
Well, but either way, I like that, like
Yeah.
the sound of it, because honestly, what's fascinating to me about that is that it harkens back to like the Greek times of like Aristotle and Plato and people like that in a sense, like Socrates and all those kind of like, because when you think about it, that's a very similar concept of like somebody just following a teacher who like, because at least from what we understand, they weren't just walking around preaching things to them every minute of every day. It was more like they followed around with them and they would tell them certain things that were important, or they'd have discussions about things, or things would just kind of come up. It was a more like natural like learning experience in a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're so focused on efficiency, another consequence of capitalism, especially when we look at schooling. Because sometimes you and I, at most, we teach maybe 4 classes a day, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Some of our coworkers are teaching 5 classes a day, just because of how many classes they've taken on. But when I sit down and think about it, these kids are sitting down. Our students take 6 classes a day,
Yeah.
with maybe 1 off mod, and most kids aren't getting 1 off mod a day in most schools. And then you throw in sports afterwards. Like, it just seems a little nuts to me, especially when these kids, like, I remember when I turned, I don't know, maybe 24, I was like, oh, I can get by with like 7 hours of sleep. And I feel pretty good. Like, I'm not, like, I could do 7 hours of sleep for a month straight, and I think I would be all right. These kids can't be doing that. Yeah, we're asking them to do that. And another thing, and Peter and I, we got off on a tangent in one of our recent episodes about sports.
We did.
I like it.
And just like how many kids are
About
on
the dangers of
just how many kids are on multiple teams, and then how they're on a team, and also that team travels every weekend. Oh, and on top of that, they have a personal trainer that they wake up at 6:30 in the morning to go and train with.
Now, all that stuff is insane. That said, kind of thematic with whatever else we've been saying here, right? Because I'm like I don't know, my total view on sports is not maybe totally worked out. But when you think about it, kids sign up for sports most of the time willingly, right? They definitely learn more from their coach than they learn from us on a day-to-day basis, right? Like, I mean, when you ask these kids about like lacrosse, they can definitely, or whatever sport they play, they can probably tell you more about the ins and outs of it than they could about most of the stuff that we spend time teaching them, right? And it does in a very direct way build character too, right? If you need to sort of like work with the team and, you know, achieve this like standard of excellence and work really hard and whatever else, like that is going to build character in you in a very direct way. So I do think that there is it's lost its mind, right, with personal trainers and travel teams and all this other crap. But I mean, I do actually think that there is, like, as far as actual education goes, I think that probably more directly serves the needs of actual education than a lot of what goes on in classrooms.
well, but if I may though, I think that's a great example actually of exactly what's wrong with the whole sports thing in a sense. Is that now it does build character, and I agree with you on that. But those other two things you just said would happen, I would argue, with other aspects of education if 2 things were in place. If A, people weren't being overloaded to the point Rhys just made with 6 classes, and instead you were studying like one specific thing, to your point, like you're focused on one sport or maybe 2 sports, but like you're not doing 6 sports in a day. Most people aren't doing 6 sports in a day, but they are doing 6 different classes in a day. The other aspect of that I like kind of found interesting was you said many of them sign up willingly. In some sense, that's true, but keep in mind that most people who do sports, who's the first instigator of what sport they do?
The parent.
Their parents.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the point that I'm making with education, is that if parents cared anywhere near as much about education of their kids as they did about signing them up for football or baseball or soccer or lacrosse or whatever, the kids would be a lot more invested in it too. Because the parents would be more involved, the parents would be the first instigators of it. Like, and you see that with some kids whose parents do that the kids end up being a lot more into school things because the parent is more involved in education or in school or in like things like that.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, you know, I still think that the kind of main thing, because whatever, right? I mean, most of the time parents do kind of sign their kid up for sport when they're 5 or 6 or whatever else, right? Now, at a certain point, though, that does sort of like the parent is not going to push a kid most of the time, right? I mean, you do hear about these insane cases, whatever, but most of the time, kids at a certain point either like take to it themselves and want to do it, or they drop the thing, right? And so I still think that the consent and the lack of coercion is still maybe the primary thing in why oftentimes sports has like a really big impact and why kids are able to learn so much stuff.
Yeah, which I'm not disagreeing with that. My point is to say that I think that's actually a really good analysis of one of the problems in the education thing right now. Because think about it. Replace that with an education thing. What if a parent brought their kid up focusing on math and they didn't have the all the other education things, like just in this like perspective that I'm drawing, this painting or whatever, they're just focused on that one like thing, math or science or whatever. And over time, that kid realizes that they can like achieve things through that. They're like, wow, like I got success. I did this. I, competed in this science fair or this, math program or whatever. I'm doing better. I'm learning more. Over time, they'd get more and more invested in that and care a lot more about it, is my argument, like in general. And I think that's one of the like issues with the whole like generalization thing in school right now.
Yeah. So it's interesting bringing this up. There was a guy, his name was Laszlo Polgar. He was an educational theorist. And he basically had the idea that if he specialized his kids at a very early age in like 3 different things, and when he chose, interesting choices, he chose chess, painting, and Esperanto, which is like this kind of made up
the fake language,
imaginary language that was supposed to be like the global language everyone would speak it and nobody does, right? But he taught them those 3 things like very, very focusedly, right? And kind of neglected the other things. I mean, I'm sure they kind of picked up here and there a little bit of history, a little bit of literature, whatever, but like by and large, it was kind of very focused on this. One of those girls became like a really, really accomplished painter. The other 2 and one became the best female chess player of all time. The other one became the women's world champion for a number of years. And I'm not entirely sure that I do think it is wise in a certain way to specialize that early or that kind of devotedly. But I mean, I will say that like by doing that, the guy was able to accomplish a lot with his kids, which is an interesting idea.
Have you guys ever read the book or seen the movie A River Runs Through It?
No,
I don't think so.
It's a movie with Brad Pitt, but it's based off of a true story that the author of the book he lived through, and his father was a preacher. This is what the movie says. I'm not sure if this is like the director of the film took liberties with the actual story, but the character makes a point that the father, the preacher, considered English the only subject worth studying, and his oldest son went on to become a great writer, world-renowned writer, and the second son was actually a newspaper writer who eventually ended up dying because of gambling issues. But that doesn't seem entirely related. If you only teach your kid English, they're going to end up addicted to gambling. I don't think I don't think there's a connection there. But yeah, there might be something to this focus sense. Because I mean, it's just if you overwhelm these kids with all these subjects, and honestly, this is my argument for integrated curriculum. Because integrated curriculum is the idea that we point out and emphasize the fact that all truth is connected, whether or not it's a historical truth, English, like literature, grammar, truth, mathematical truth, scientific truth. All truth is connected if truth actually exists. And kids don't necessarily see that nowadays because we're continuously separating these truths. But if we have this integrated curriculum in which Mr. Stahl is teaching social studies, so he's going to read the Communist Manifesto.
All right, we got to explain that one.
I'll explain that, yeah. So Brian is teaching the Communist Manifesto to his students. Well, in English.
That sounds wrong out of context, but
I taught the Communist Manifesto to my students, not in a positive sense, but in an analytical sense. And so here we go. Brian's teaching the Communist Manifesto. In English class, they're reading Animal Farm. And then in my theology class, we're reading Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum addresses basically the rise of communism. Communist Manifesto addresses like what is communism, what are its goals, and then Animal Farm is just from a literature perspective of what would happen if we applied communism. It's also prophetic in a sense too, but it's also very simple. So just imagine being a student and your 3 teachers are covering the exact same topic but from a different perspective. It's a lot less overwhelming at that point. They don't feel the need to be, I'm being pulled in 3 different directions. No, I'm being pulled in the same direction by 3 separate things. It's 10 times easier. And so I'm not necessarily sure the answer is let's focus on one subject. Let's just be better at teaching. I think it's be more united.
Well, go ahead, Brian.
No, I was going to say another thought that it's interesting because sometimes I actually ask kids, hey, I have this, hey, Mr. Stahl has this kooky educational theory. What do you guys think about it, right? And their answers are always really interesting because often enough, I don't really understand this, right? But often enough, these kids who self-consciously don't like school are like, no, man, we can't do that. We can't change it that much. I'm like, you sure? Like, really? Because you're failing my class right now, kid. But whatever. But, one thing I proposed to them is, all right, ready? And I think they do this. I'm not sure if they still do this in England or they just used to, but whatever. At least at one point in England, the way that it worked was that starting around high school age, so when you're 13 or 14 or whatever, you would pick sort of 4 subjects and say, okay, sure, this is the thing I want to do.
like this.
So, like, for me, like, whatever, at that point I knew that, like, math and science were just not something I was ever going to flourish with, right? Would have taken, I guess, probably English and history and maybe French or Latin or some other thing, right? I don't know. And to me, that makes a whole lot of sense because by that time, I mean, it's whatever, right? Like early on, it's like, okay, sure, expose kids to a lot of different things, let them figure out their interests and figure out their strengths, whatever. Well and good. But at a certain point, you kind of know, right? Or at least for me, certainly at that age, I knew. And most kids, I used to teach middle school kids, and I asked them about this, and they were all on board with it. And, or I shouldn't say, there's one girl who was like, no, everyone needs to take math. Okay, fine. But that was actually.
As a teacher, I will say, no, they don't.
No, they don't. Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, man. I can still tell you the quadratic formula, but.
Really?
Yeah. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Check me on that. I dare you.
No, I know that
Dare
too.
you.
I can verify. That's spot on. I said sarcastically.
But whatever, right? Like most people can't do that, right? And so most of them, how is most math? Because math is always the thing I get pushed back on. Like, oh no, you need to learn how to do math. Whatever. Right?
I've never heard anyone ever say that. We
Really?
need to learn math.
Oh, I hear that. You should ask kids, like, should you have to be forced to take all these subjects? Because what they're going to tell you is, yeah, or at least some kids are going to say it's really important for us all to take math.
What?
Yeah, but that's probably because none of them like math. That's probably why they're saying that.
They're saying,
Or they don't think they like math. So
they're saying that they
should
shouldn't be forced to take math.
No, they're saying that they should be
No,
forced
but
to.
think about it logically. They could be saying that they should be forced to take it because otherwise they never would.
Oh, maybe.
I think you're giving kids more credit than they deserve.
Well, anyway,
kids are.
The point, though.
Whatever, right? Like, I mean, normally, insofar as anyone pushes back against this, it's always, but we should really learn math. Like, that's an important thing. I think it's just because it's esteemed by everyone else, and so they just kind of like, without really analyzing it or thinking about it that hard, they kind of sort of just convey that same prestige onto this subject.
Well, math teachers are always, every school I've been to, the math department is the department that always has it together the best.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
And so I think the kids catch on to that.
See that too,
Yeah.
right? Sure. And the highest standards are from parents or on math, I think, and whatever else. Where was I going? Hold on, we got off track.
Yeah.
Okay, right. But then, so when I get pushback on the idea that okay, sure, you should be only forced to take like 4 or 3 classes and kind of specialize from there. The pushback is always from the direction of, okay, sure, no, we should take math. That's really, really important thing. We should learn all this stuff, right? Whereas when you actually start thinking about, can I still figure out why the AAS proof in geometry works, or how to take a derivative the long way, or how to do some of these other things that at a certain point I learned but are now fuzzy, if not non-existent. No, right? I don't remember any of this stuff. And the vast majority of people don't either. And so like the actual amount of like learning that people do that they do not want to do is just, I think, very, very small. And so that's why I think people should be. And then also, as from a teacher perspective, as soon as a kid gives even a tiny little bit of consent and says, I even want to be here just a little bit, I've chosen this just a tiny little bit, it's just so much easier to do your job.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I used to teach chess, and it was night and day doing that versus, because kids would just sign up for that if they wanted to do it, right? It wasn't it wasn't a course. And teaching that was so much easier than it was to teach religion or history or any of the things I've ever taught. It was like night and day.
And if I may bolster this argument in a sense, again, to use the analogy or to draw the comparison to the sports thing, think about that what we're describing right now is what a lot of people do with sports. That they will have like 3 or 4 different sports that they do as a younger kid. Like think about it. There's a lot of kids who grow up doing like, they'll do football and baseball, and then at this season they'll do lacrosse, or they'll do, they'll do soccer, or they'll swimming or whatever. Like they do all these different sports, and then at some point, typically around like middle school or high school, they end up condensing it down to where like now they're focused on like 1 or 2 sports. And it's a similar, I realize it's not exactly the same, but it's a very similar thing in the sense that like if you allow them to then, to your point, I'm just agreeing with you basically that to your point, if in high school, let's say, the kids then choose like, I'm going to focus on these subjects after they've gotten a basic knowledge of everything in a very base level, then I think they would be more motivated to specialize in those things.
Yeah, I would think so too. You know, one thing, the reason why I was so as Peter was talking, I was kind of giggling over here a little bit. Part of the reason is because there's like this weird argument about whether chess is a sport. And a lot of people will like go to, I am not one of these people. I'm a chess fanatic, whatever, but it's not a sport, okay? There's an argument for it to be a sport. I don't think it flies.
What's the argument for it to be a sport?
Okay, all right, man. This is going to be a chess podcast now. Cool. You know what? Cool. I can talk about that all day, too.
Go right
All right,
ahead. Can't
so-
wait to hear it.
Yeah, I bet you're really. He's looking very enthralled right now. So basically, the idea is that if you were to. So, how about this? The best chess players in the world work out like maniacs. Huh? What? What's
Wait,
Brian
what?
talking about? Yeah, no, they actually do. When you look up like articles on this, like when you look up Fabiano Caruana's workout routine, the guy is a maniac. He runs for like
Magnus
2 hours a day.
Carlsen's is Magnus Carlsen?
Yeah, Magnus, right?
He
Yeah,
looks pretty jacked.
he is pretty jacked.
He
right,
might be
sure.
roiding. Yeah. Do they do doping? Do they test for supplements? Adderall, maybe.
That's why I had to get out of it, man. I peed in a cup. My career was over.
They're like,
No. Anyway, but the reason why they do this is because, you know, when you play chess for 5 hours and you're focusing really, really intently, if by the end of the game you are like really, it'd be like, how about this? If you were taking an exam, a final exam for 5 hours, by the end, and your grade was really important, whatever else, you're really focused and dedicated to it, by the end of it, you'd walk out of there, you'd be toast.
Mm-hmm.
And the last few questions might have just be, you know what, whatever, man, I'm just going to write down C. Going to just choose that one arbitrary. I'm not even going to read this thing. I'm too tired, right? It's a similar type of thing in chess, where if you're playing for 5 hours and you're really focusing intently, you're going to be tired by the end. And if you're in really poor shape, or you're old, you're fat, or you're whatever, like it's going to affect your game. And so the argument is that since it takes a physical toll on people, it's competitive and whatever else, that's what makes chess a sport. I don't buy it. I don't think it works.
because it takes a physical toll on people, and it isn't in the spirit, because it's in the spirit of competition.
Correct.
It is a sport. Trying to think of what other things we would call a sport by using that definition, but none are coming.
So, I mean,
Well, anyway, so
the
what was
reason-
your point though about the chess thing that you were?
Dude, I don't know.
That was like 5 minutes ago, Peter.
yeah,
Come on.
I don't know, man. Also, wasn't this podcast supposed to be about Catholic education? Or just
Well, no.
Well,
we
no.
were-
So I was
we were
gonna say
start off on it.
we should jump into like
So
the
let's-
Catholic thing so we can kind of wrap things up. But like, so what?
Well, so here's something we should consider. Do you want to put on the brakes now and then come back later for a part 2?
I'm down for that, man.
Because Catholic education is a big topic that I don't think we can cover in 15 minutes. I think Catholic education is
Fair
something
enough.
that is going to take an hour plus.
Probably.
Yeah.
I
So,
agree.
yeah, Peter, do you and I want to talk a little bit more? Like, I can pause and Brian can bounce out, and then you and I can talk a little bit.
That's fine. Whatever we
yeah.
want to do. I mean, or if we want to wrap up that conversation real quick. But yeah,
Yeah.
So, background on this, by the way, is that I'm really excited to go back home and watch. There's a tennis tournament going on right now. This girl, Ons Jabeur, is just
It's
awesome.
female tennis.
It's female tennis. What's the
Oh
problem?
what's wrong with female tennis, Rhys?
It's less interesting.
Wow.
Ouch, town population, the whole female species, man. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I just don't find tennis that interesting to watch.
Well,
personally,
there's
but
that. Okay, all right. But if it wasn't for the Williams sisters, okay, I don't think anyone would know female tennis was a thing. Yeah,
Oh
that's
my gosh.
that's hyperbolic.
So-
that's
oh
hyperbolic.
my gosh.
You
I
should
don't even-
smack
I
it,
don't-
Brian.
Okay. I want to
right, you're fired from
name
this
me
podcast.
5 female tennis players.
You want me to do this?
I do.
Wait,
I'm sure you
like-
can.
like
I think I
active?
can name
Active.
at least 3. Oh, active. I
Active.
don't think
I can do active.
Active, yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, sure. Iga Swiatek,
Okay.
Sophia Kenin, Ons Jabeur, Jessica Pegula, Coco Gauff. There you go, 5.
How many can you name?
Probably more than
A
that,
lot. I don't know.
Okay, I
probably
want to go
name
on
one of
this.
them
I
sisters.
want to take this episode to the streets, and I want to ask someone to name me 5 female tennis players. Okay.
It had to be
Okay.
act. I don't know, man. You might. Yeah, I don't know. Well,
It's just this
yeah.
is okay. Can we spend like 5 minutes on
Let's
this?
talk
Okay.
about tennis.
No,
Yeah, at this
no.
point-
I don't want to talk about tennis. I want to talk about the fact that you're
Wait,
on
what?
a snow day in Maryland. You're like, ooh, I am stoked about this female tennis match.
I don't see a problem with that at
Okay,
all.
first of all, is this like, was it Wimbledon or
Oh,
something?
no, dude, no. Okay, it's the Australian Open. Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one, though.
Okay,
The Australian
It's
Open's
one
a
of the
big one.
four
Still
majors,
women's,
yeah,
but
right.
in Australia, yeah.
Yeah, women down under. Sure, okay, whatever. Right, yeah.
Sorry,
I mean, they couldn't play Wimbledon now. It's too cold.
Oh
Whatever.
my gosh. See, here's the thing, dude. My plumber buddy just texted me. Cool. Sorry, I've been needing my dishwasher replaced. And okay, never mind.
Do you have a buddy who's a plumber?
Kind of.
My parents need a plumber.
I wouldn't. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so
maybe your listeners need a plumber too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. You can help this guy out.
He's already in a union. Every time I ask, because he already has a full-time job. He's not like he doesn't have his own company. If he was, I'd be like, oh yeah, heck yeah. It's more of like, hey, can you come after your full shift and do this thing for me?
Fair enough.
Now back to women's tennis. How did you get into women's tennis?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I got into tennis. My parents watched it growing up, so that was part of it. My dad just watches all sports. He's just like a junkie.
New Jersey folk.
That doesn't. No, it has nothing to do with it.
No, it's just men of a certain time period, I'd say too. My dad watches a lot of sports in general too.
Yeah, sure. And so I kind of like had respect for the sport. Like, I don't know. I think a lot of people, their parents don't watch it, so it's like this other type of thing, right? Okay, sure, we're gonna watch football, we're gonna watch baseball. It's like a real sport, and tennis is not, which doesn't really make any sense.
Tennis is a real sport. I will agree.
Okay,
with that.
cool, right? Yeah. I've had people argue me on that. I don't know, but which doesn't make any sense. But whatever. And so, and you know, I mean, in when I was in high school, I mean, that was sort of in a certain way the kind of peak of tennis ever, really. I mean, you had Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, and Novak Djokovic were all kind of at their respective peaks. And so these are the pretty much unanimously agreed the three best tennis players of all time who are all just like dominant, right? Like at their absolute heights. And so it was really, really exciting and interesting to watch because every single time you didn't know what was going to happen. You kind of knew it was going to be one of those three guys in the finals, but you didn't really know how it was going to shake out. And so that was interesting. And then once you start to learn the sport and get interested in the sport, like, okay, sure, then you can kind of branch out besides these three guys who you just watch kind of dominating everybody else. And that's when you start to watch the women's game. Now, a couple things to say in favor of women's tennis in particular, okay? So, sure, like, the men are obviously, like, more athletic, right? And they can do a kind of a better job. Whoa. Okay, sure. Serena Williams, like, she played one time the guy who was, like, ranked 203rd in the world and just got smoked.
Yeah,
okay? It wasn't close, right?
Sure. I was going to... Yeah.
Anyway, so the men are more athletic, but there's a way in which sometimes that it kind of enables them to sort of almost transcend the limits of the sport and make it almost less entertaining sometimes. Because, so, I mean, some of these guys can...
okay. So it's kind of like...
It's almost like they're too good at it.
It's my big qualms with the NBA now.
I agree with that, too.
It's like, I'm going to go ISO, and ISO, for people who don't know that, is just like, hey, the guy, the point guard, or the guy at the top of the key has the ball, and he's not going to pass it to anyone, and he's just going to play one-on-one, which is so boring to watch.
Yeah.
Okay,
that makes sense. And when you watch these guys who are like 7'6", just basically get up on their tippy toes and dunk the ball in, it makes it kind of not exciting when it happens then, right? I mean, like, part of the thing is that part of what makes sports entertaining is just watching people do things that are just sort of like unusual and extreme and whatever else. And in basketball is a great example because these guys, so many of them are so good that the game has become too easy for them and it gets kind of boring and dry to watch. Now, that isn't really the case in tennis, but it can be sometimes for the men's game, just insofar as like some of these guys can serve the ball faster than my car can drive, right? Just like it's just insane. And just getting a racket on the thing is an incredible feat of athleticism, it seems to me. Now, when both players are incredible athletes, it makes for great viewing. But when there's a mismatch, it can get really, really boring. Like massive serve, and maybe the guy manages to hit it, but it's like a flub kind of thing.
There's no volleys.
Yeah, right. Whereas the women, because of the fact that they can't, I mean, there's a handful of them who can serve really, really strongly, but a lot of them just aren't able to do that to the same extent. It makes the games kind of more varied and sometimes more interesting.
Okay,
that makes sense.
That makes sense. Whenever I think of women's sports, I think of the WNBA.
Okay, now we're going to talk about Caitlin Clark. Okay, Caitlin Clark, the girl in Iowa. Have you seen this person?
Oh, yeah. She's kind of got some spunk.
She is a stud. Does not have some spunk. I don't know what you're talking about, man.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I meant.
She's making like half-court shots, dribbling behind the back. Okay, ready? I was watching her the other day. I like women's sports. Okay, whatever, man. Sue me. Okay, I was watching the other day when she's on there, they like triple team her. She has so much gravity. Gravity, by the way, means that people kind of like flock to you to like give you extra coverage and whatnot.
Like gravity works.
Like how gravity works, right? It's just a sports term, fine, right? And so then the way that it works is that she gets triple teamed. She just throws it to somebody who is just like, and she's a fantastic
open, right?
Wide open.
Right.
They take a jump shot, boom, right? And then when she came out of the game at the end, because she fouled 4 times or whatever, and they just pulled her out. Like the whole game was totally different. Like the defense just had a totally different strategy. Like, all right, Caitlin's in, we're going to play one way. Caitlin's out, it's a totally different way. It's girl is the truth, man. She is the next up and. So how about this? Ready? She is going to do for the WNBA what like Tiger did for golf. What
People thought Brittany Griner would do that for the
They were
WNBA.
wrong.
Yeah, they were wrong.
Yeah,
And
right.
then she
Caitlin's a different thing, man. Caitlin's
Yeah,
the
but
real deal.
Brian, the fundamental problem with that is just the fact that it's the WNBA.
What does that
It's
mean,
never
though?
going to get that much like recognition.
I don't see why that should be the case.
it's just,
I'm not saying it should or shouldn't. I'm not taking an opinion on that, but I'm just telling you it's not going to get that kind of recognition.
We'll see, man. I don't know. I mean,
it is getting an increase, but I don't think it's going to get.
I don't know. I mean, so why do you think the WNBA is not popular? Like, give me a reason.
Less athleticism, no dunking.
Okay, so those things are kind of ruining the regular NBA, like we just talked about, right? And so there's a way in which, again, because these guys just transcend the limits of the sport gets kind of dry and boring. And so it does actually allow the WNBA to, in a certain way, be kind of more like the game is.
I would argue on a more basic level. I think that fundamentally men tend to be the more prominent ones who watch sports. And I think men just tend to gravitate toward men's sports.
There's probably some truth
For
to that.
whatever reasons. Again, I'm not going to try to figure out all the details of that, but I just think on a really basic level, you could just look at the evidence that I think there's probably stats out there that would agree with this too. I bet that like more men watch sports in general than women. Not that there aren't plenty of women who do watch sports, but just on the whole, I think there's probably clearly more men. And I think in general, the men tend to gravitate more towards the men's sports. And so like, just on a basic level, like if you think about it, if the viewership were perfectly even, then you could see an argument that like the women's sports might become just as popular or more popular. But I think the viewership is just different.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think you're right. So here's my final word on Caitlin and why I think she's going to change things, okay? So when you look at the history of sports in America, normally the sports position in the popular culture changes when there's a sort of like transformational must-see athlete, right? People only started turning to football because Johnny Unitas was the thing to see, right?
I wasn't alive then. So.
Well, me neither, but that's what I've been told. Okay,
I'm not sure if I would agree with that, but go on.
Well, okay, sure, right? But I mean, whatever, right? I mean, a lot of people tune in to watch basketball for the first time because they had heard all these things about Michael Jordan. A lot of people who were not golf fans tuned in to watch Tiger Woods, right? Caitlin Clark is, I mean, I wanted to go see her. She's coming to Iowa, or I'm sorry, she's coming to Maryland to play against the Terps, right? I wanted to go watch her. Tickets were, no, listen to me. Tickets in the cheap seats were $150.
Wow.
Okay, $150.
Crazy.
Yeah, I know, because people want to go see her,
You
right?
talk about her like she's your favorite band. You guys hear? She's coming to town, and we're gonna.
Well, anyway, so wait, so okay,
So
you're
my
going to
point
see
being,
it.
I was
Got
going
VIP
to, right? I
passes.
can't really. I mean, $150 is a lot of money, right?
Oh,
But
okay,
whatever,
not
right?
for a
But those were the
teacher,
cheap
yes.
seats. I mean, you get up close, it was like $400, $500, right? Yeah, and you look at like regular women's like college basketball, the tickets are like $15. Okay, so like she's got a fan base.
Well, no,
it's
yeah.
slowly growing. She's also almost certainly going to be drafted first by the Indiana Fever. Okay, so that's near her Midwestern fan base already. Okay, get ready. The Iowans sculpted her image in butter. Okay, if you look at the Iowa State Fair butter sculptures, you're going to find one of Caitlin Clark. She's already got like this big contingent of people who want to watch her. She's on SportsCenter all the time. She could change the WNBA.
I'm
That's what
super
saying.
happy for Caitlin.
Okay, I guess you don't care.
But I
No,
think-
no,
I think-
do.
okay.
No, whoa, okay, you made a point that I haven't gotten a chance to rebuttal. Okay,
Sure.
You were talking about how dunking in the NBA is what's ruined it. I agree. Like not dunking itself, but like the overemphasis on it. Okay, and how every top 10 is LeBron James slamming it down someone's throat for the millionth time. It gets boring. Okay, but the response is not to completely eliminate dunking.
No.
And there's none of that in the WNBA. There's like 8 women who can dunk. Okay, and when they do dunk, it's like oop, bloop, like whatever that soundbite was. It's just like watch a compilation video of WNBA mistakes, and it's like I'm watching a high school game right now.
Okay, I don't know.
It's-
But
Because college basketball is super entertaining because it forces that teamwork, working together,
that's
ball
true.
movement. And WNBA should be using that too, which it is, but it's just at a slower speed and less entertaining.
perhaps. Okay, so maybe we'll have another podcast about Catholic education and about the WNBA.
yeah,
Okay, we'll do that. All right, guys.
Brian's got to go
Yeah,
watch
Yeah,
female tennis.
That's exactly
Thanks
what I
for
got to
joining
do.
us,
And
Brian.
I'm proud of it. All right, see you guys.
Yeah, bye. All right, Brian is gone to go watch. I want to be abundantly clear. I'm not a sexist.
I was gonna say you might want to clarify that because it did sound a little bit that way.
Women's sport, first of all, if someone were to ask me, would you rather watch women's gymnastics or men's gymnastics?
Oof.
I would probably rather watch women's gymnastics.
Yeah, I know
Okay.
I would.
Yeah. I mean, Peter, It sounded weird the way you said
What?
it. Okay, never mind.
No, I'm just saying
I
that
know.
like I think it's more. I think they're frankly, I think they're better at it than
Oh,
men. In my
yeah, I would
opinion.
agree.
Like,
yeah.
that's what I meant.
Yeah, yeah. I know that's what you
I
meant.
didn't mean anything
I just-
weird by that.
you were just like, I would. I was like, okay, Peter. I know you didn't mean that.
I know.
Like, yeah, obviously I'd rather watch women's
He's
gymnastics.
just dying apparently.
I am. They're much more graceful, and it just looks so much cooler when they
Yeah.
perform than men. It still looks cool when the men do it, but I think women's gymnastics is above and beyond. But when it comes to other sports like women's basketball, tennis is different because the Williams sisters have just. Brian was talking about that female basketball player whose name I forgot.
Caitlin something.
Caitlin
I've
something.
never heard of her
Like
before.
the Williams sisters were kind of like if Caitlin ends up being the thing that causes the WNBA to blow up and maybe not meet the NBA standards, but like be just a step below that.
Yeah,
The Williams sisters were that for tennis,
absolutely.
you know. So yeah, you get a once in a generation athlete that also has like this great story, this great personality. Like, yeah, that could radically change the sport. But I just remember, this sounds terrible. I was listening to sports radio as a kid, and they did this tournament of sports that no one wants to watch.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had like 10 sports, and you know how like a bracket tournament works. Okay.
Yeah,
And they would just get to like these 2 sports at the end, like which is the one that you'd want to watch, like you would actually want to watch. Okay. And it came down to, I think it came down to women's tennis versus women's figure skating. And all the guys agreed that they would rather watch women's figure skating because there's a chance one of them's going to eat it during the routine. I would have to agree, to be honest. Brian, I can't believe this. Okay. All right. He's leaving.
well, he's not here to defend himself, but he'll come back and he'll
Yeah. Hopefully
next time when we have him back, he can.
Okay, so education. We'll talk about Catholic education during part 2. But the points we made about education, what is education, leading someone to the truth, the modern understanding of education seems to be, let's get you ready to work, basically, or be good enough to work.
Basically, let's get you through these particular like goalposts and tasks, almost in a sense, to get you into a place to work.
And not even do a good job at doing it, and also do such a poor job at it. We ask ourselves the question, why do I even have to do this to get to that job? Like, I have a student who has his own landscaping company. Okay. When that kid looks at me and says, Mr. Gadbois, why do I need to get my high school diploma? His landscaping company is already worth 5 figures, which isn't like a whole lot. But like for a 17-year-old, okay, who has more than $50,000 worth.
Actually.
What?
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, no, he's an awesome kid, and I've asked him, like, he has a tree. I have a tree that needs to be taken down, and he doesn't do trees, but he has a tree guy. Like, he's already networked. He has his connections. He knows how to get referrals.
No, yeah, I
And-
don't mean it in a bad way. I mean,
No,
that's
no,
kinda
no,
crazy
yeah.
in like a good way.
Yeah,
That's
no,
wow.
it is. No,
It's impressive.
It's very impressive. He was working like 50, 60 hours a week over the summer. He's paid off all of his equipment that I'm pretty sure he bought. So when that kid approaches you and says, why do I need to be in school? It's tough to have a good answer when the modern
Yeah.
understanding of education is to get you to that point. But what if the kid's already at that point? So that's why I think we need to fall back on this understanding of education being about leading someone to the truth. And therefore, whether or not the person has a career laid out for them, they still need to be led into the truth.
Yeah, and I think this is something that, not to go too far down another kind of aspect of it, but I think this is something that I meant to bring up earlier that I kind of forgot, and we just had other conversations and stuff, but is about the individual aspect of education too, in the sense of not individual in the individualistic sense of it, but individual in the sense of, to the point of like the landscaping kid, that like every person is different. And I think that's one of the things that like, and this might be maybe something for us to talk about a little bit when Brian comes back for part 2 eventually, but is to get his perspective too on this, because I think it's so fascinating to me of, you know, you guys in your roles as high school teachers, of how to try to, you know, like how does the education system as a system, how does it account for the fact that every person is different and learns differently, learns at different paces? Some people do need more education than others. Some people don't. You know, like there's so many, and that's where the parent thing obviously comes in on some level, to my point of like, if parents get to know their kids well, they can help them with that. But then I think that I would argue that gets back to the point we talked about earlier of the whole right to education thing, that like, yes, you have a right to education, but you also shouldn't be required to. So like the landscaping kid thing to me is a great example of that, that like he doesn't need to get a high school diploma. Now, he might because of like the modern standards that exist. But what I mean is that on a very basic level, if he is successful in that business, there should be no reason why he needs to have a high school diploma.
Yeah, and also you were kind of starting to get to this point as you were making it, as you were just speaking. It's kind of silly that I have 100+ students and I'm expected to give them equal attention.
Mm-hmm.
I can give them equal attention, but that attention is just going to be extremely limited if it's going to be equal.
Correct.
And also to further expand your point where you were talking about each kid is different in their own way and they learn differently and so on and so forth. Like there was this document that came out a while back about learning intelligences. Like there's different types of intelligence
Mm-hmm.
and there's different types of learning styles as well. And I've just, sure, yeah, there's different types of learning styles, but come on, there's no way I can cover every learning style every day I teach in my class.
No, of course not.
Like
That's not realistic.
But what happens to the kids who don't learn that way? You know,
Exactly.
like I just can't. And so I don't know. When I think about the education system, it just stresses me out because it seems like this beast that I can't conquer because I can't. Yet it drastically affects my job and my ability to do it well, and it makes me just want to start my own school. But I also don't know exactly how I would do that, nor do I have the money to do that. But
yeah,
his kids clearly deserve some attention, and I can't give 100 of them the exact same amount of attention. And that's just, I mean, like Ryan made the point: if you can get a kid to invest just slightly, like boom, that's a spark that can turn into a forest fire. That's all a teacher really needs. And there are some kids you have to work really hard for.
Yeah.
To get them to get a little interested in. And there are kids who I've taught who I can't even tell you their names anymore. I would see their picture and I'd be like, oh, I know them, but I may not be able to remember their name, who just fell out the wayside. And I try to talk to every kid, and I called their name out for attendance every day for at least 3-4 months. So yeah, the system seems to be more concerned with efficiency rather than actually leading to the truth.
For sure.
Kids, we're not so sure if they're apathetic. I think they are apathetic. I do think apathy has been a thing.
Well, I don't think Brian was arguing they aren't apathetic. He was just questioning whether they're more apathetic than they ever have been in the past.
And I was going to say, I think they are more apathetic, and I think it's because they're more distracted. Which
well,
is the
yeah,
point that
and
you
that was
made.
kind of what I was proposing about the distraction thing. Is that
because they would rather be distracted than doing this thing. It's really complicated. I don't know exactly how to fix the education system. I have suggestions, but I'm looking forward to talking more about Catholic education next.
Yeah, I think that would be really good, and we can bring back up the Land O'Lakes thing and all that.
Because Catholic education is weird because we have this freedom to do something different, but the majority of Catholic schools are just doing the exact same thing that public schools are.
Well, and that was something that when we have Brian back on, I want to talk to him about that, because that was something that he mentioned at one point about like the whole thing of private schools following the same curriculum in a sense, because like they have to, there has to be this universal standard so that people reach the same degrees and all that. And this was a tension that many of us talked about in seminary too, because the seminaries would even follow like the same standards of like degree programs when it came to like theology degrees and things like that like the broad US does. And many of us were like, why should this matter? Like we are a Catholic institution doing things the way we want to. Like we don't need to have the same, standard for this as everyone else. We could have our own standard, and there's nothing wrong with that.
The answer to the question as like to what's the problem with modern education, it's the college board. It's colleges who are calling the shots. The reason the seminary is the way it is because they want to be accredited.
Correct.
And the companies in charge or whatever the institutions charged with accreditation are primarily working with universities. And the reason Catholic school, so I work at a Catholic school. I want to be abundantly clear. Sure, I have frustrations with the fact that we're not more different than the public schools, but I understand why we're not, because we want to attract people to come to our school.
Mm-hmm.
And to attract them, we have to promise them what the public schools promise them, but in a better sense.
Yeah.
It's a lot more challenging to promise something entirely different. and say, hey, we're going to do a different model of education that the public schools do not do. And it's going to be finicky to get your kid accredited. Because like for example, classical schools, a lot of kids who are athletes run into problems at classical schools because the way their curriculum works out, the kid, let's say there's a star football player who goes to a classical school, right? They graduate with the classical school with a high school diploma. Great. But according to NCAA regulations, from the last time I had this conversation with someone, the kids need to take an extra class over the summer to be eligible to play college sports because the classical programs do not meet all of those requirements. Doesn't make sense. Don't know how it works. But like I said, we are all, when it comes to education, dependent upon what the college boards determine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I just I'll leave it with this question because I don't think we should answer it right now. It's too long of a question to answer. But that one of my arguments, and I've had this with several friends of mine, and I know people who agree with this, but one of my arguments that I would make is that I don't think that as Catholics we should care about that, in the sense that I tend to argue that that's almost like a version of living in the world, of the world, not in the world, in the sense that as Catholics we're supposed to live in the world but not of the world. And even things as mundane in one sense as standards for schooling in that sense should not be something that we feel beholden to as Catholics. We have to be very cautious about allowing the world that is not led by the church to be leading us in our standards for things. And I think that's a question that I'll leave for the listeners to ponder. And, I mean, you can say something if you want, but what I mean is that I don't want to go too far down that discussion right now. We can have that discussion when we talk more about Catholic education. But
I think that will be the main topic of discussion, next time with Brian. Why are Catholic schools trying to be like the other schools when to be Catholic is actually to be countercultural?
Exactly.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I think that's a good conclusion to this episode.
Yeah.
This is Of Mountains and Men. I'm Rhys.
And I'm Peter.
You guys have a great day. God bless.